And so I
Yeah.
started what I called casting sessions with dramaturg. And we basically sat down and were like, okay, if someone has a really strong sense of intuition, deeply has a strong moral compass, knows what right from wrong means to them, is willing to stand behind that moral compass and do what it takes, also, deal with the consequences of whatever, that action is. I am talking about our high priestess, but I'm also talking about Elphaba from Wicked.
Yeah, right.
So when we
Yeah.
talk about the archetypes we see in the tarot, we see them
Mm.
across the theater canon too.
Welcome to Sacred Stories of the Spirit. My name's Jordan and I'm your host. And today's conversation is for anyone who's ever felt like they were living inside an old script that no longer fits. My guest is Emily McGill. She's a former Broadway publicist who has walked a winding path into life as the Ivy League witch, a spiritual psychologist, tarot reader, and creator of the Hirschfeld Broadway Tarot. We talk about what it really feels like to step outside of a shiny, socially approved identity and into a truer one, including Emily's experience of masking her neurodivergence in the high-pressure PR world and the messy, vulnerable work of reintroducing yourself to people when you start showing up more authentically. And then at the end of the episode, Emily offers a collective reading, a little pick a card moment just for you. So if you'd like to play along, stay tuned and keep listening right to the end. And if you're curious about identity shifts, spiritual psychology, neurodivergence, or simply new ways to listen to your own wisdom, then settle in and enjoy this conversation with Emily McGill, the Ivy League witch. Well, Emily, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here for a conversation today.
Oh, Jordan, thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be connecting with you.
Now, tell me about your path from Broadway publicist to Ivy League witch and spiritual psychologist. What a journey.
Yes, it really is such a winding journey. I grew up as a theater kid. I loved Broadway and the theater and performing from the time I was very young. So I always sort of had this singular goal to move to New York, to work on Broadway, and was really fortunate that I made those dreams come true right out of undergrad or uni, as you all may say.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I moved to New York. I started trying different jobs, doing different things. I found myself really enjoying what I saw the press representatives doing, sort of out and about, covering interviews, attending events with the talent and supporting them. And I really thought that that was an alignment with my gifts of care and empathy and wanting everybody to feel welcome and belong.
Yeah.
And so when I had the opportunity to join a press office, didn't really know what they did, started out as a receptionist, sort of worked my way up, worked on a bunch of cool Broadway shows like Billy Elliot, Memphis the Musical. I got to do A Raisin in the Sun with Denzel Washington. So worked on these like big celebrity driven plays as well. And then, sort of fell into this PR career that I quickly realized once I stepped outside of the Broadway world, I hated it. I got into a sort of very traditional PR agency as their in-house Broadway person. And I was like,
no,
this is the job when you're not representing a show and the thing that you love. And so, it was really a challenge at that point in time. And I also spent a lot of time and energy masking my neurodivergence at that time. I wasn't really aware of sort of where I sat in the spectrum of neurodivergence. And so, constantly sort of fitting myself into an expected box. And getting out of sorts as I was doing it was a challenge. And so when the pandemic hit, I was actually kind of relieved, to tell you the truth, because everything shut down. It was an opportunity to reconsider the path that I had taken, the journey I was on, if I wanted to continue on the trajectory I'd been on, or if there was sort of an adjustment that needed to be made somewhere. My therapist at that time, I mentioned to her during a session that I had had this sort of intuitive hit that was like, I think I'm supposed to go back to grad school. And I think it's for religious studies. And I was so perplexed by that as someone who had been raised in the Catholic Church and sort of had abandoned all of that, in my late adolescence, early adulthood. I was kind of like, what does this mean? I don't really know. And being the type A overachiever that I am, I was like, I don't think I want to move to New Haven right now, because in my mind it was like Yale Divinity or bust. Like you go to
Oh,
the top or you
okay.
don't do it. So, I mentioned that to her and she said, I think you should check out a program at Columbia. They have something kind of similar that might interest you. And that was on a Sagittarius new moon by happenstance. That was the date of the session that we were sort of speaking about this. And by the Sagittarius full moon, that 6 months later, I was sitting in my summer intensive with my cohort, having
Wow.
sort of the first
Okay.
6 credits of my program as this like immersive experience that we had at the very beginning. Found
Yeah.
myself in this incredible community that, coming from the theater, you really think about theater kids being sort of
Yes.
outcast and, misfits a little bit. And so like building community from there. And I felt even more at home in this community at the
Fantastic.
Spirituality Mind Body Institute at Columbia University's Teachers
Okay.
College. So it was a really amazing experience to feel like I had sort of found my people in a really beautiful way. And so it was quite sort of the winding road. I've lived lots of lives in the interim, but I'm very, very grateful for every step of the journey that's led me to where I
Yes.
am today.
Fantastic. I just wanted to circle back because there was
Yeah,
something that you mentioned just about your neurodiversity
yeah.
and the masking that was going
Hmm.
on. Tell me about that. And I'm interested because I wonder if more of us are doing that masking than we ever realize. How
Yeah.
long did it take you to know that that's what you were doing, the masking?
It was really upon reflection that I understood what was happening. I would say it
Yeah.
was several years after I left that role that I really understood, what I had been doing. I was there for 3.5 years all in and had this sort of understanding or an expectation of what like a quote unquote New York PR girl was supposed to
Ah,
be.
yes.
And
Okay. Yeah.
so there was this sort of story I had told myself about the expectations of
Yes.
having the type of job that I had. And then, of
Yeah.
course, being reinforced by the lovely and wonderful humans that I was working with, but
Yeah.
that sort of suited some of the stereotypes. And
Yes.
plenty of them also didn't. But for me, it was like, my nails had to be done and they had to be done perfectly. I only wore Big Apple Red from OPI was the only color I would wear on my fingers and toes. I had like a bright red lipstick. I had a Steve Jobs black cashmere sweater, black skinny
Yeah.
jeans, like
Yeah.
uniform. And it was sort of
Wow.
just this understanding that I had created for myself of
Yes.
this is what this type of person portrays themselves as on
Yeah.
the exterior, so that I could sort of fit in. Of course, I never really did. I was, the gal who had live plants on my desk. I would bring coloring books to brainstorms because I was like, it helps me
Yes.
be more creative. Like, what do you want?
Yeah.
So I was definitely marching at the beat of my own drum, but I felt as though I still needed to sort of contort myself into something that was more acceptable in the setting that I was in.
Yes. Yes.
And then I would say, a lot of armchair psychiatrists and psychotherapists and things on TikTok and Instagram and
Yeah.
folks just talking about their own experiences being neurodivergent.
Yes.
That upon reflection, I was like, that's what was happening then, So it
Yes.
was, yeah, it was quite the journey. And now
Yes.
that I've sort of embraced my neurodivergence, it's been a kind of different challenge that I've faced where some of my confidence in, public settings or in relational settings, new communities, unfamiliar settings, sometimes even with people that I've known for years and years and years and years, but now I am sort of showing up in my life differently and don't know how I will be received in those sort of
Yes.
spaces. I did feel like I had a major confidence sort of dip in the last couple of
Yes.
years as some of that was happening. And that was all internal as well. It wasn't anybody else treating me differently or behaving differently in my life. It was all on the internal side.
Yes. It's incredible. I mean, congratulations, by the way, for going through that journey.
Thanks.
I think it's a big thing to release these old stories of,
Mm-hmm.
and I think sometimes it's even the realization that sometimes they're not imposed by anyone else. We are telling ourselves these stories of who
Yeah.
we need to be in that role, and for you to be able to even reflect and release that old story is beautiful. But I also really feel empathy for that journey of what happens when you release that old identity and you find yourself showing up in a more authentic way. But it doesn't make it necessarily easier because you
No.
you have to I suppose it's a little bit of showing up in a different way so people don't quite know this person. You have to re-educate people. You
Yeah.
have to find a new way of connecting. And it's not necessarily easy work. So have you found it getting easier over time, or are you still finding your way?
I'm still finding my way, but I think that the thing that makes it a little bit easier is reminding myself that, like, I don't know what anybody else is thinking. I have no control over their perception of me and how I
No,
sort of am being received by them. And in some cases, it's really about like introducing myself to people,
exactly.
like
Beautiful.
I remember specifically a friend of mine invited me to an event that was one of the sort of first Broadway gatherings of like industry people and like the people that are like make or break sort of some folks' careers. And it was a breakfast, and I was so incredibly anxious going there because I hadn't been
Ah,
to anything in quite a long time. And I was
yes,
like, I don't know how I'm going to be received in this space. And that was before I'd had the realization of like, or maybe more of the acceptance of I have no control over how that
yes,
reception happens.
yes.
But it was definitely, challenging. And even still today, it's sometimes it's kind of a fake it till you make it kind of confidence and just, doing the best that I can and
Yes.
trying not to beat myself up after the fact if I said the wrong thing, or I felt weird in that moment, or I felt that there was a weird energy moment happening or something like that. Like working on letting that stuff go and kind of releasing that energy so that I don't sort of
Yeah.
get stuck in that.
Yeah. There was something that you just reminded me that I think is actually very empowering for all of us. And I think I should remember it too. The fact that we can reintroduce ourselves to each other because we are
Yes.
all growing and changing and evolving. And that's probably really a really handy thing to do more often than we think.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's the kind of thing where like, my mom likes to say something like, "Oh my God, but you love like insert thing here." And I'm like, I was 10. And
Yes,
like I'm a
exactly.
40-year-old woman now. Like there have been 3 decades between then and now, and I think too, sometimes it's a little bit easier in certain instances for us to accept that sort of like reintroduction. I'm thinking about
Yes.
people that are newly in parenthood or maybe newly married, or, there's sort of these like socially acceptable
Yes,
ways that people
absolutely.
have identity shifts that happen sort of in
Yes.
the external facing world. But when it's an internal sort of shift, then you have to continue to like, I don't want to say you project it out, but you allow it out, right? You show up with that vulnerability in your authenticity. It also gives other people
Yes.
permission to do the same thing because they're also probably freaking out about, whatever the thing is that is happening
Yes.
in their life.
Yes, and it makes me think, part of this podcast is a conversation about the world as a shifting landscape.
Mhm.
We're kind of in this big transition from a lot of the old systems and structures to new systems and structures, new ways of being and new ways of being with each other. And when you talk about those identity shifts and the ways that we know of, the ways that people have traditionally been able to talk about an identity shift, they are some of the old structures that we've all had and grown up with and know easily.
Yeah.
But I think there's huge value in creating these new permissions to say, this is a different transition. This is a different identity shift that is internal. And this is on a different level. But I think they're incredibly profound, which, yeah, I think there's so much to be done there. Well, I hope you're enjoying the second series of Sacred Stories of the Spirit. This season, conversations traverse change, identity, and belonging, and they ask us how to live with more integrity, more courage, and more connection, both to ourselves and each other. Together, we're looking at what it means to live story as practice, to let story guide our healing, our growth, and our understanding of what's possible in the day-to-day. Stay with us as we journey through the landscapes of courage, authenticity, and transformation. Tell me about your experience with the tarot. I mean, you describe it as texting yourself a meme. What do you
Yes.
what do you mean by that?
Yes. So I was introduced to the tarot by my very first therapist. My
Okay.
grandmother had passed away, and I started going to therapy. And anytime I sort of didn't know what direction to go with something or didn't know what I wanted to do, my therapist would say, "Why don't you pull a card and see what happens?" So that's
Yeah.
really how it started. And then in about 2017, I decided I wanted to have a practice for myself, just some small daily practice to start cultivating that. And she said, "Why don't you start pulling a card?" And I was like, "Well, I don't have a deck." She was like, "There's an app for that. because of course there is.
Oh, okay.
And I downloaded the Osho Zen Tarot deck app and started
Okay.
pulling a card on my phone every day. Getting rid of that little red bubble was like joyful. And now I get to see this beautiful image. And sort of within the app are all of the descriptions as well. So you tap the
Okay.
card and you learn the meaning of it.
Okay.
And I started doing that for myself. And then when COVID hit, I had just been gifted my first copy of a tarot deck and had started sort of reading for other people, weeks before New York shut down.
Okay.
And so that was sort of the beginning of my getting to read for other people and sort of like my professional tarot career beginning. But
Okay.
I say it's like texting yourself a meme because there's something in your heart or your gut, right, in your subconscious and your unconscious. And we know that the body holds that subconscious and unconscious information, but it hasn't necessarily made it up to our heads yet, right, to like the intelligent thinking brain, the mind. So the tarot is like a picture's worth 1,000 words. So when we take
Mm,
that and we slap some text on it with a meme, all of a sudden it has a new layer of meaning. Similarly,
yeah.
when you pull a tarot card, now granted, there are lots of archetypes and lots of symbolism, and there are so many decks on the market these days. So, every deck has its own sort of approach to that symbolism and the archetypes, but the underlying sort of collective consciousness information is there. So when you
Mm,
pull that card and then you add your own lived experience on it, kind of the way
yeah.
we add a text to a photo to turn it into a meme, now all of a sudden we've got a new layer of perspective with which we can explore what's happening in our lives, in our hearts, and in
Yeah.
our guts. So
Yeah.
I really think of tarot more as a psychological tool than a fortune or a future telling tool.
Mm, yeah. That makes
I'll
sense.
oftentimes say it's kind of like a Rorschach test. Rorschach is when you see the ink
Ah, yeah.
blots and then you
Yeah.
look at them and it's like, what do you see? Do you see a bumblebee or a spider or a tree? Right. You're like, whatever it is that you see in that, there is no right or wrong answer. It's really just about
Mm,
your perception of it.
yeah.
And I think tarot is very similar in that sense. There
Yeah.
is no
Beautiful.
right or wrong answer. We certainly can say that this particular card tends to mean this thing. And
Yes.
what does that bring up for you? How are you experiencing
Yeah.
that? So that's kind of
Yeah.
how I see it as more of a psychological tool. And, texting yourself a meme is just a catchy way
Yeah.
to say it.
Yeah. I love it. Now, your master's thesis at Columbia examined tarot as an effective tool for self-reflection. So
Yes.
I suppose one of those pieces of reflection is that it's applicable when you add that layer of personal experience and lived
hmm
experience. But what were some of the other insights that came out of that research?
It was incredible. Everyone had a 2-card reading with me. We asked some questions ahead of time and then afterwards. One of the questions was, do you have more clarity now that you've had your reading? And on a scale of 1 to 10, what is that number? And the average number across all of the participants was 7.7 on that scale of 1 to 10 as far as increased clarity goes.
Yeah, wow.
So we had 100% of respondents say that they had some sense, even the people who, in their qualitative data was like, well, I don't really know what it's in relation to, or I'm not 100% sure what it is that's supposed to be clearer. They
Yes.
were still saying they had a 7 or an 8 on that 1 to 10 scale. So
Yeah,
I was
amazing.
really excited about the fact that there was sort of some hard evidence here to prove that it can, again, with a skilled practitioner, it does allow you to sort of dig a little deeper into what's going on. And
Yeah,
and some folks had like major aha moments that were happening for
yeah,
them. And others, it was sort of like reinforcing information that they already knew, but didn't want to acknowledge, or maybe didn't have the language to name it yet. And so again, that sort of like, right, that heart gut moving up into our head experience.
yes. I love it. And it's a different understanding of tarot than I think many people probably have.
Yep.
And I think it kind of sits in that space of, what we see historically where you turn up, you get a spread or you get a read, and that information is provided to you in terms of, options for your consideration. But there is certainly a sense that it's someone else giving you a reading, where I think what you're saying is actually this is more of your own ownership of what's coming up, integrated with some of your own sensory experience and reflection. Would that be a correct interpretation?
Yeah, I think so. Like I said, theater kid, right? So everything I do is
Yeah.
very collaborative. I want everyone to
Yeah.
play their part, right? You need all of the parts in order for the show to succeed. And so I kind of think of it more like I'm holding up a mirror for whoever it is that's having the
Yes.
reading, and they are reflecting, and I'm, just kind of helping them do that.
Yes, perfect. So how do you usually do your readings? Do you do when you sit with people, do you do like a 1 card or a 3 card, or how do you kick off these sessions with people?
Yeah, I have a few different ways that I work with folks. So if I'm doing a private session one-on-one with someone, depending on if we're doing a sort of shorter, like closer to 30 minutes session or a longer 60-minute session, we'll either pull 3 cards or we'll do a 7-card spread that I really love called the Flying Bird. And that's in the Osho deck. And with those, again, very collaborative, going through this process together. If we're doing a virtual reading, I'll like flip through the cards so someone can cut the deck.
Okay.
If
Yeah.
we are physically together, they'll cut the deck themselves. But yeah, my favorite 3-card reading is where what will help you, what will hinder you, and your untapped potential. And I
Oh,
love
amazing.
doing that one.
Yeah.
And I think that it really helps us sort of see like, oh, there's something already here that I'm doing that I can lean more into. Here's something I need to be a little aware of. And here's something that I hadn't even considered could be
Yeah.
beneficial or helpful to me.
Yeah, I
So
love that.
that's like one of my absolute favorite spreads to do. Now, when I get hired to do tarot at events quite often. And
I
so,
saw this.
yes.
Yes.
And
I'm really interested. So I was seeing that you've done these incredible events like New York Fashion Week, and I was just thinking about that. With all of that busyness and all of that energy, is it a challenge to get people to sit and think through this experience, or is it just part of the atmosphere at the moment? And it's
yeah, it tends to be sort of an additive to whatever the event
yeah,
is. So, for example, for New York Fashion Week, it was the opening of a flagship store down in Soho, and they were having a great big party with a bunch of influencers and press and things like that. And they wanted to have a really interesting activation for the attendees. So I usually get set up either at a small table with 2 chairs or a high top table, and I'm sitting in a bar stool. And it's an opportunity. Only pull 2 cards for people when I'm doing event
okay,
readings.
yeah,
I will never pull an extra card unless the cards physically jump, which does sometimes
okay.
happen when
Yes,
you're
they do. I've
shuffling.
seen it.
They jump. So, but only a 2-card reading. Nobody gets a second round. I'm pretty
Okay.
strict with my
Yeah.
boundaries and rules when I'm doing events because there are so many people coming through, right? Like in a minimum
Yes.
2-hour event, I'm probably seeing anywhere from like 12 to 15 or 20 people, depending on how quickly
Yeah.
we're getting through readings. So, it's a lot. It's a lot of energy that I'm also sort of like
Yes.
processing and channeling in those moments. But I absolutely love them because most people think they're just going to have a cocktail with their friends or they're like hanging out or doing whatever.
Yeah.
And then they sit down and have this 2-card reading, and all of a sudden, like, some like they get hit with a ton of bricks and some huge life-changing moment is happening and it's the most
Yes.
unexpected places.
Yes.
And yeah, sometimes it's like really chaotic party energy happening around us. But usually I find once that person sits with me, whether they are physically seated or standing across from me at a high top table, we sort of like just create our own sort of little connection or container that we're working within. And more often than not, people have a very, very positive response to it. And I
Yeah,
remind them,
beautiful.
sometimes the meaning of this reading isn't going to come up for you for days, weeks, months, sometimes even years. And you look back and you say, oh my God, that's what that reading was about. Wow. Okay. Right.
Yeah.
And then those moments of sort of recognition can happen. So I think that while there's sort of madness happening around sometimes in like a party atmosphere, then it's also an opportunity for whoever is getting the reading to sort of like slow down for a minute, sit down, be still, and do some reflection.
Yes. Yeah. I have a slightly random question for you. And
Yeah.
this is just because I was having a conversation about crystals the other day with
Mhm.
another guest on the podcast. And I was talking about the fact that I had bought this beautiful golden healer crystal and was getting absolutely nothing from it. So just to your point about sometimes you don't know when a reading will have relevance. So it might be
Yep.
now or in the future, or, what this guest told me, which is kind of, I loved it. And I was cranky at the same time. He said, yeah, that crystal's not for you.
Uh-huh.
You know,
Yeah.
you're going to give that to someone and they're going to have an incredible experience with
Yeah.
it. But I want to know, do you ever have that experience with readings where you might give a reading for someone, but actually the reading may not be for them? It may be for someone in their life or someone they're connected with. How do you find that kind of goes?
Yes. It's so interesting. I oftentimes think about how in many instances, especially when you're doing sort of spiritual work, like deep energetic work, you're more of a steward than anything else.
Yes.
Right. And so like for that crystal, it sounds like you're a steward of that crystal, for the time being until it finds its correct home. But I have had instances where, somebody sits down to do a reading and we start pulling cards. And usually it's not like someone else external in their life. Usually it's like if their friend is standing next to them and the friend maybe has strong energy, they'll take over the reading.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
If you're new to Sacred Stories of the Spirit, you might like to go back and listen to Series 1 of the podcast, where the journey began. In this first series, we explore the transformative power of story and how the act of sharing, reflecting, and reframing our experiences can help us make sense of who we are. So if you haven't already, I invite you to take a listen, and hopefully you'll find something in each episode that's timeless, whether it's an insight, a question, or just a moment of recognition and reflection. Enjoy. Now, I'm really interested to know about the Hirschfeld Broadway Tarot. Can you tell me about it and maybe even show it to me?
Here we go.
It's
the
so
Hirschfeld
beautiful.
Broadway Tarot. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Like I said, lifelong theater kid, always loved it. Big musical theater fan as a kid. As an adult, I've really become much more of a plays person. But I wanted all of this to be represented. And very selfishly, during the pandemic, I was like, I want a Broadway themed tarot deck, like for my collection. And I didn't see anything on the market that I loved, And so I started what I called casting sessions with dramaturg. And we basically sat down and we're like, okay, if someone has a really strong sense of intuition, deeply has a strong moral compass, knows what right from wrong means to them, is willing to stand behind that moral compass and do what it takes, also, deal with the consequences of whatever, that action is. I am talking about our high priestess, but I'm also talking about Elphaba from Wicked.
Yeah, right.
So when we talk about the archetypes we see in the tarot, we see them
Mm.
across the theater canon too. I mean, stories are one of the oldest practices that we have, right? Like in very ancient times, we sat around the fire and told stories like, Ron got eaten by a lion over there. Don't go over there. You don't want to be like Ron, right? Like these stories literally kept people alive. So this is a very ancient primal thing that we sort of have in this collective unconscious. And I was like, well, there are all these sort of mirrors in the theater. So I kind of sat on the project for a while. My publisher at Running Press, my editor Maria, was amazing and approached me and she was like, so weird. I saw that you have this splash page about this thing that's in development. Like, can we talk about it?
Fantastic.
And it was just the perfect relationship. And I am not an artist in the sense of drawing or painting or sort of anything like that. But Al Hirschfeld is one of the most prolific theater sort of capturers of the theater of the 20th century. He had I think it was like almost 75-year career, starting in like 1926 maybe, and he died in 2003.
Fantastic.
So unfortunately, he passed before we had Wicked, so Elphaba is not in the tarot deck. But I did get to work with his foundation directly, and we mined the archive of 10,000 images to see what sort of characters could be aligned for each of the archetypes in the tarot. But then we had to take a look at the artwork and see if that also sort of evoked the feeling that we wanted it to have. So a good example is the Fool card, which is the very first card in the major arcana of the tarot. And for those who aren't familiar with tarot, we've got two parts. Our major arcana are like our magic cards. So when they show up, we pay special attention. They correspond to the hero's journey. Joseph Campbell laid that out very beautifully. So if you're also into the psych stuff, check that out. And the minor arcana is more like a deck of playing cards, right? We have our 4 suits, our 4 elements that correspond to those. Ace through 10. The big difference is we have 4 what we call court cards instead of 3, right? So there's a king, a queen, a knight, and a page. And in our decks of playing cards, at some point, the knight's got the boot, and we just have the king and the queen and the jack, right? But when you think about it that way, all of a sudden, 78 cards doesn't feel quite as like overwhelming. When you see that there's we can break it down into pieces, it gets a little more accessible. And so I was working with the Hirschfeld Foundation, and I always knew that I wanted the musical theater character Pippin to be the fool, because it's a great show from the 1970s that Bob Fosse did with Stephen Schwartz. And it's all about this character that goes on the hero's journey, which is our fool card. The fool is the one that like steps off and away we go. You know, we're off to see the wizard, right? Dorothy is another great example of that. And I was like dead set on Pippin. And then we looked at the image of Pippin drawn by Mr. Hirschfeld, and he's on his knees. And that really doesn't evoke that essence of like, we're going to start a journey. So we thought we were going to actually go with Dorothy, either from The Wiz or The Wizard of Oz. And it was kind of like the 11th hour. We were finalizing a bunch of things, and I was looking for something. And for some reason, I looked up Candide, famous opera, and operetta, but also sort of has a musical theater kind of version. And the image of Candide that Mr. Hirschfeld drew showed him with the knapsack over his shoulder, the sort of stick with a kerchief tied around it, which is exactly what the fool is carrying in the Rider-Waite-Smith tarot that Pamela Coleman Smith, designed over, I think, 15 years ago at this point. It was such a clear indication of this is supposed to be Candide, because in some moments, like the synchronicities, you can't ignore them, right?
Yeah.
It's almost like Mr. Hirschfeld was speaking from the grave, like, hey, use this one instead, please. So it really was sort of this like kind of puzzle about putting together not only the character that aligned, but then the artwork as well.
Fantastic. Wow. How exciting. It just sounds a brilliant way to integrate so many different things that you care about and believe in. It's just lovely.
Thank you.
Well, listen, thank you for the conversation.
Do we want to do a quick poll?
Yes, please.
Yeah?
What would you like to do?
So we'll pull a quick card. Actually, there's a fun game I like to play. Kind of like a pick-a-pile, the way we see them on TikTok and Instagram. So we'll pull 2 cards, and everyone who's listening or watching can choose if they want card number 1 or card number 2. Sometimes people want both.
Yeah.
Do you? I'm like, whatever is working best for you, I say go with it. And we'll pull 2 cards and give everybody a quick little reading.
Yeah,
okay.
Great.
So we're going to do that flipping through the deck that I was talking about, so you can cut it for us. Are you ready?
Okay.
Tell me when to stop.
Stop.
Okay, perfect. All right. So I'm going to try and play too. I always forget because I look at them. So we've got card number 1 here. I'm going to hold it here so I can't see it. And card number 2 on this side. Oh, Jordan, curious for you first, if you're feeling... And like oftentimes if I'm doing this, I'll tell people, okay, close your eyes, take a deep breath, right feet on the ground, like let's settle down and ground into it. And you certainly can if you want to pause this and sort of ground yourself and take a breath and choose if you want 1 or 2. But curious what's popping for you. Number 1 or number 2?
Immediately 2.
Amazing. I love that. I'm actually with you. Every single time I pull a pick-a-pile, it's always number 2. Whether it's 2 cards or 3 cards or like whatever the layout is. I don't know what it is, but so we'll start with card number 1 for our number 1 folks. And for that, we have the Hermit reversed. And in the Hirschfeld Broadway Tarot, this is actually Virginia Woolf from a one-woman production of A Room with a View, which was sort of done as a play instead of an essay.
Fantastic.
And, we see sort of this character is, thinking about In a room with a view, it's all about how like women retreat for themselves into a place that is just for them, right? So that hermit
Yep.
energy, that sort of going within or stepping into the dark, right? We oftentimes, if we think about hermits from sort of like a cultural and sort of historical perspective, they were
Yes, the
hiding
cave.
in the woods in a cave by themselves kind of thing, right? And so this idea of like maybe stepping into the darkness or stepping into that kind of inner story that we're telling. And reversals are something that some people like, some people don't like. I love them because I think they add another layer to all of that
Okay.
sort of exploration that we were talking about
Yep.
earlier. And my favorite interpretation of a reversal is through another card in the major arcana, the hanged person. And that
Yes.
card's meaning is all about having a practice in patience, that things might not happen in the timeline that you anticipated or the order that you would ideally have. It's also about a shift in perspective, right? Because it's literally a character that is 180 degrees flipped upside down. So we see things, sometimes if we get stuck in our heads, I personally, like, I'll get into downward dog just to sort of look at the world differently for 30
Fantastic.
seconds, couple
Yeah.
of breaths, and then come back to whatever it is I've been dealing with. And so I would say that this, maybe for our number one folks, it's like maybe there is an opportunity for you to be spending more time by yourself, or you're sort of getting this itch or this calling to do it, but you're not really sure how. You might have kids, family, parents, spouses, partners, work that are relying on you to show up. But you also need to sort of put your own oxygen mask on first, right? Like we say on the airplanes, in order to be able to help everyone else around you. So this may be an invitation for you to find those moments of solitude anywhere you can, or, maybe they won't look the way you thought they would. Maybe they'll be while
Yes.
you are in the shower or making lunch, or, they could show up in really unexpected ways and places.
Yeah. Beautiful.
Excellent. All right. So for card number 2 for you and I, oh, we've got the Magician, also reversed.
Oh,
And
fantastic.
so the Magician in the Hirschfeld Broadway Tarot is P.T. Barnum from the musical Barnum. So, a real person, right? P.T. Barnum was like the king of sort of the illusory, and, people might say he was a con man, with his circus and his sideshows and sort of making up things. He was definitely exploitative, right? If we're like really going to look at the actual historical value of this.
Okay.
We
Yeah.
did choose to go with the more musical theater, sort of polished, cleaned up version, thinking about the Magician as one who, yes, can have that sort of creating illusions and maybe not necessarily making things clear, right? That's sort of like the I don't want to say negative expression of the card, but maybe the lower sort of vibe
Yep.
version of the card. But the beauty of the Magician is that they hold every tool that they need to do what they are here to do within them. They have access to
Fantastic.
every single thing that they need to make the impact that they're supposed to make, to teach what they're supposed to teach, right? Because the Magician is also the first card after the Fool in that major arcana.
Mm.
So it's the sort of teacher of the Fool. The Fool learns how to take these tools, the 4 elements, the 4 suits of our minor arcana, and
Can
how
I
to
tell you,
utilize them. No,
tell you
please.
something interesting?
Yeah.
I was with a dear friend who I know is going to love this episode of the podcast
Yeah.
a few months ago in the Blue Mountains in New South Wales, Australia. And she's also a tarot reader. And
Mm-hmm.
we'd been thinking that we would do a reading together. We never got round to it. But when I was just having a quiet moment in the lounge room, I had her deck, and without meaning to, a single card popped out. And can you guess which one it was?
Yeah, I can, because the Magician has been stalking me too.
It was the Fool,
Oh,
actually.
really? Wow. Oh my gosh. I was like, oh no, she's totally talking about the card that we just pulled. That's so funny. Wow. Interesting. So you're
So I
going
love
on
that
this
there's that
hero's
journey there. Yeah, I think that's really fascinating. Tell me what the inversion means for the Magician.
Yeah, so I mean, again, I think it's that practice and patience and that sort of exploration of like a different perspective around it. So I think in this instance, I would say that the tools or the resources might not seem like they are helpful to you, or they might not seem like they are, in alignment for what it is that you're trying to do. It might not make sense for the direction you're sort of think you're going, but that doesn't mean that, you didn't pick it up for a reason. It all sort of is intentional, right? The universe has a much broader perspective
Yeah.
on why things happen and what is happening than we as humans in these meat suit bodies could ever know. So, as
Yeah.
we are allowing the universe to experience the world through our individual perspective, we might not see something as a tool. We might not see it as something that's helpful. We might think it's a hindrance. We might think it is a poison, when in actuality, it's the antidote to something else that,
Yes.
we might have thought was the sort of treat, and we've been overdoing it. And then, right, that can then become the poison. So I would say,
Yes.
again, that it's about sort of seeing the things we can't see in this instance,
Yes.
of
I
that there
love that.
is
Yeah.
usefulness and there's purpose and reason for the gifts that we have and the things that we go through.
Yeah.
And again, that
I have
timeline might not be what we think it's going to
yeah.
be.
Yeah. I love that. And I also talk about this a lot. I talk about this with friends and with other guests on the podcast, that you never know where the teaching will surface from. So
Mm-hmm.
anything can be a teacher, and the things that you don't know are a teacher will actually give you wonderful lessons and insights. So I'll take that in mind when I think about that
Yeah.
card.
Yeah.
I
And
think
how
teachings
interesting
are
that,
all over the place.
you went from just like having a random card jump that's the first one to now we're doing a little mini
Yeah.
reading and it's
Yeah.
the next card right in order.
Perfect.
I
I love
love
it.
it.
Well, thank you for that. That's beautiful. And I think just having that extra depth in terms of the Hirschfeld deck and that resonance with the characters and the stories that we know and love, I think it gives an extra layer to interpret the
Mm-hmm.
experience with. So beautiful. Thank you for sharing that.
Yes, my pleasure.
So, Emily, where can people find you, and what have you got next on your to-do list?
Yes. So, as far as my spiritual psychologist practice, you can find me on Instagram. My handle is Emily Ann ANMCG. I also have the Broadway Tarot. So, if you're looking for the tarot, you can find us there. Usually, I kind of cross post with everything. So, if you find me at one, you'll find me at both. My
Yeah.
website is EmilyMcGillEntertainment.com. And I am taking applications for coaching clients if folks are interested in having a new coaching container or exploring that. We do use tarot as part of it, but that is not the entirety of our practice. So,
Yeah.
it really sort of helps us tap into some of the things that we then get to work on in our
Yeah.
sessions together.
Yeah.
And yeah, always looking to do events and connecting with awesome people and talking
Beautiful.
to folks like you, Jordan, who
Yeah.
have great communities that are interested and curious and, maybe seeing tarot through a different lens or looking things from a different direction. And we're going to start doing some Broadway tarot dressing room readings with Broadway
Oh,
actors in
fantastic.
their dressing rooms. So that is
Wow.
in development. We've got a few in the
Love it.
can. We're not quite yet to the point
Yeah.
where they're online yet. Maybe they will be by the time this
Yeah.
comes out. But yeah, so we've got some fun things
Yeah.
happening.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again for the conversation. It's been lovely having you here for a chat.
Jordan, thank you so much for inviting me in. I'm so grateful to be here. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, I hope this conversation with Emily has given you something to sit with, whether it's the idea of reintroducing yourself to people as you change, the courage to drop an old costume, or a new way of thinking about tarot as a mirror rather than a prediction. As always, I'd love to hear what landed for you. You can share your reflections with me directly or on social or wherever you're listening to this episode. If the podcast is sparking something within you, please follow, subscribe, and leave a review. This helps the podcast reach more people who are navigating their own identity shifts and sacred stories. Thanks for listening, and until next time, take good care, and I'll see you again soon.